In January of 1943, in the middle of a world war, the federal government signed an order about bread. Not tanks, not fuel. Bread. One line in war food. Order number 1 would quietly change the chemistry of nearly every loaf sold in America, and almost no one shopping for a 9-cent loaf. That Winter understood that the thing being added had nothing to do with flavor at all. Somewhere in this story is a vanished ingredient that made wartime bread genuinely different from what came before. And before we're finished, I'll show you the deficiency diseases that were quietly disappearing from American hospital wards while it happened. The National Park Service, the FDA, and the National Academy of Sciences all keep records of how this unfolded. And the records tell a stranger story than the white, soft, forgettable loaf would ever suggest. So let's pull the thread. To understand what changed in the 1940s, you have to stand in an American kitchen a generation earlier and notice what had already been lost. For most of human history, bread was a coarse, living thing. The wheat berry has 3 parts: the starchy inner endosperm, the oily little germ at its heart, and the bran that wraps the whole kernel in fiber. Stone-ground flour kept all 3. It was darker, heavier, and it smelled faintly of the field, of something that had grown. And it spoiled. That last word is the key to everything that followed. The germ is rich in oil, and oil goes rancid. Once you grind the kernel and free that oil, the clock starts ticking. Within weeks, the flour turns, develops an off smell, goes bitter. For a farm wife grinding her own grain at the kitchen table, that was fine. You milled what you needed and baked it soon, and the kitchen filled with the warm, nutty smell of fresh meal. But as America urbanized and bread became something you bought rather than made, that short shelf life became a problem nobody wanted. And the milling industry had already solved it, decades before the war, with the roller mill. The roller mill wasn't an American invention, but America scaled it like nowhere else. The technology matured in Hungary, in the great mills of Budapest, before crossing the Atlantic and taking root in Minneapolis, the city that flour built, where the falls of the Mississippi powered a cluster of mills that would feed much of the nation. By the 1880s, companies whose names still sit on grocery shelves were turning out what the trade called patent flour, the purest, whitest fraction of the endosperm, prized above all the rest. The roller mill's gift was control, where the old millstone crushed everything together. In a single pass, grinding bran, germ, and endosperm into one meal, the roller system cracked the kernel gently, and then sorted the fragments through a cascade of sieves and rollers, separating the pale heart of the grain from its darker, oilier wrappings with an almost surgical precision. It was a triumph of industrial engineering, and it handed the country a flour of unheard-of uniformity and keeping power. It also, with the very same motion, swept the most nutritious parts of the wheat into the byproduct stream, sold off cheap as animal feed. The country was, in effect, feeding the richest part of its grain to livestock and keeping the starch for itself. And almost no one yet understood the bargain they'd struck. The roller mill, which spread through American flour production in the late 19th century, did something the old millstones never could. It cracked the wheat and systematically sieved away the bran and the germ, keeping only the pale, starchy endosperm. The process is more methodical than people imagine. The grain is cracked, the coarse material sieved, then passed through roller after roller, and separation after separation, each stage pulling more of the bran and germ away, until what remains is almost pure endosperm, ground fine and pale as chalk. The result was white flour that could sit on a shelf for months without turning, because the very part that spoiled, that oily germ, had been engineered out. The standard white flour that emerged from this process kept only around 70% of the wheat kernel by weight, an extraction rate that threw away nearly a third of the grain to win that pale, stable powder. There's an irony worth pausing on here, because for most of human history, white bread had been the food of the rich. Refining flour took labor and waste, sieving away the dark parts, throwing out usable weight, and only the wealthy could afford the pale, fine loaf that resulted. The poor ate dark, coarse, whole bread because it was cheaper, never guessing that the brown loaf they resented was carrying nutrition the white loaf had lost. The roller mill flipped that ancient hierarchy on its head. Suddenly, white flour was the cheap, mass-produced default, and the whole grain bread became the specialty item. White shipped well. It stored well. It baked into a soft, uniform, snowy loaf that looked clean and modern, and for the first time in history was within reach of everyone. By the early 20th century, white bread wasn't a luxury anymore. It was the default. Factory bakeries turned it out by the millions of loaves, and Americans, finally able to eat what only the rich once ate, loved it. The economics of that trade were brutal and simple, and they explain why nobody reversed it. A factory bakery shipping bread across a region needed flour that wouldn't turn before it sold, and white flour, stripped of the germ, could sit in a warehouse or on a shelf for months. For a business built on volume and distance, that wasn't a small advantage. It was the whole game. The longer shelf life let a single bakery serve a whole city, then a whole region, turning bread from something baked fresh down the street into a packaged product trucked in from miles away. The white loaf wasn't just a taste preference. It was the engineering choice that let bread scale up to feed an urban nation. And like most engineering choices, it came with a cost that didn't show up on the receipt. Here is the quiet catch, the thing nobody marketed on the wrapper. When the milling industry sieved away the bran and the germ to win that long shelf life, it also sieved away most of the kernel's vitamins and minerals. The endosperm is mostly starch. The nutrition, the B vitamins especially, lived in the parts that got discarded. America had, without quite meaning to, traded the nutritional heart of its daily bread for convenience and a longer shelf life. And for a couple of decades, very few people connected that trade to what was happening in the country's hospitals. But doctors were starting to notice, as factory white bread and heavily milled corn took over the American table, particularly in the rural South. Physicians recorded an unsettling rise in two specific diseases. One was pellagra. The other was beriberi. Both are deficiency diseases, the kind that come not from a germ, but from an absence, from something missing in the diet. Pellagra is caused by a lack of niacin, a B-complex vitamin. Beriberi is caused by a lack of thiamine, another B vitamin, sometimes written as vitamin B1. Both can be serious, and I'll keep this strictly as documented medical history rather than any kind of modern claim. The point the historical record makes is simply this. The more refined the American grain supply became, the more these particular deficiencies showed up. The connection investigators eventually drew was to the nutrient-stripped flour and the degerminated corn at the center of so many plates. The pellagra story in particular had been building for decades, and it's worth slowing down on because it explains why the country took the missing nutrient problem so seriously by the 1940s. In the early 20th century, pellagra tore through the American South. The records are grim. By 1912, according to histories kept by the National Institutes of Health and the state's own archives, South Carolina alone counted some 30,000 cases of pellagra, with a death rate near 40%. In 1909, the disease had already been reported across 26 states, and at its peak, it was killing Southerners at a rate that filled asylum wards and pauper graves. For a long time, doctors assumed it was an infection, something contagious. They were wrong. The man who proved them wrong was Joseph Goldberger, a physician with the U.S. Public Health Service. In 1914, the Surgeon General, Rupert Blue, asked him to investigate. And Goldberger went south and started looking instead of assuming. He noticed something nobody could explain by germ theory. In orphanage after orphanage and asylum after asylum, the inmates, eating a monotonous diet, came down with pellagra. But the staff, the nurses, and guards eating better almost never did. If it were a contagious disease, it should have struck both. It didn't. Goldberger became convinced the cause was the diet itself, what he called the poverty diet of meal, meat, and molasses, heavy on corn and short on fresh food. In a now famous 1915 experiment, with a Mississippi governor's cooperation, he placed 11 healthy volunteer prisoners on that restricted corn-based diet, and several of them developed pellagra. The disease, he showed, came from absence, from something the diet lacked. Goldberger went further than most scientists would dare, because the contagion theory was stubborn and he needed to kill it outright. To prove pellagra was not catching, he staged what came to be called his filth parties. He, his wife, and a group of volunteers deliberately swallowed and injected material taken from pellagra patients, the kind of exposure that would have spread any true infection, and not one of them came down with the disease. It was a grim, almost reckless demonstration, but it made the point with a force no chart could match. Pellagra did not pass from person to person. It came from what was missing at the table. Goldberger even showed that something in certain foods, what he called the pellagra preventive factor, could both cure and prevent it. Foods like fresh meat, milk, and eggs, the very things the poverty diet of corn and molasses lacked. He had the cause and the cure in hand, years before anyone could name the molecule. The naming would wait for Conrad Elvegem and his dogs in 1937. But the shape of the answer, that a deficiency disease is healed not with medicine but with the return of an ordinary nutrient to ordinary food, was already clear. And it was exactly the logic the enrichment program would one day run on. Here's the poignant part. Goldberger proved the link to diet, but he died in 1929 of cancer, without ever identifying the specific missing nutrient. It wasn't until 1937 that the biochemist Conrad Elvegem, working at the University of Wisconsin, pinpointed it. Feeding small amounts of niacin to dogs suffering the canine equivalent of pellagra, he watched the disease retreat, and the same nutrient soon proved to work in humans. The missing thing had a name at last: niacin, the very B vitamin that the milling of corn and wheat was stripping away, the very nutrient that would soon be added back into America's enriched flour. So by the time the bakers and the government sat down in 1941, the scientific groundwork had already been laid in the orphanages of the South and the laboratories that followed. They knew what was missing. They knew what it did when it was gone. The only question left was how to put it back into the food everybody ate. So that's the mystery sitting underneath the soft white loaf of the late 1930s. America had built a bread that was cheaper, whiter, and longer lasting than anything in its history, and in doing so had pulled out the very nutrients that an earlier, coarser bread had always quietly delivered. The forgotten ingredient in 1940s bread isn't a single exotic thing you can taste. It's the answer to that absence. It's what the country decided to put back in, and how, and the federal order that made it happen. The turning point came not from a baker or a chemist working alone, but from a war. As the United States edged toward the Second World War, the military began examining the young men reporting for the draft, and what the doctors found alarmed them. The poor nutritional condition of a meaningful share of these enlistees raised a national question that had been easy to ignore in peacetime. A country preparing to send millions of men into combat suddenly had a vested, urgent interest in whether its population was actually well-fed. Hunger and deficiency stopped being a private misfortune and became, in the planner's eyes, a matter of national strength. That concern brought 900 delegates to the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C. over 3 days in late May of 1941 for the National Nutrition Conference for Defense, convened at the direction of President Franklin Roosevelt. According to the National Park Service's account of the home front, the room held doctors, home economists, dietitians, farmers, union leaders, and food industry professionals. An unusual coalition gathered around a single question. How do you improve the health of an entire nation quickly, using the food people already eat every day? Out of those same sessions came the first set of recommended dietary allowances, the numerical guide to daily nutrition that would shape American eating for generations. But the headline idea, the one with the most immediate reach, was about bread. The answer they landed on was elegant in its practicality. You don't change what Americans eat, you change what's in it. And there was no food more universal, more daily, more woven into every income level and region than bread. Nearly everyone bought it, nearly everyone ate it every day. If you could put the missing nutrients back into ordinary white bread and white flour, you could reach the entire country at once, without asking anyone to alter a single habit. The vehicle was already in every kitchen. You just had to load it. This is where the forgotten ingredient finally comes into focus. And it's worth being precise, because the records are precise. In 1940, the Committee on Food and Nutrition, the body that would become the Food and Nutrition Board, recommended adding 4 specific things back to flour: thiamine, niacin, riboflavin, and iron. 3 B vitamins and 1 mineral. These were, not coincidentally, among the very nutrients that the roller mill had been sieving out with the bran and the germ for decades. The plan wasn't to restore the whole grain. The white loaf would stay white, soft, and shelf-stable, milled the same way as before, germ and bran still removed. Instead, the missing nutrients would be added back into the flour before baking. The industry coined a word for it: not restored, not whole, enriched. It's worth naming what each of those 4 was actually doing, because together they read like a map of what the mill had cost the country. Thiamine, vitamin B1, is the one whose absence causes beriberi, a disease that can strike the nerves and the heart, and it was vanishing from the diet along with the germ. Niacin was the answer to pellagra, the niacin whose lack Goldberger had chased through the orphanages of the South. Riboflavin, vitamin B2, governs the way the body releases energy from food, and its deficiency carried its own catalog of signs that physicians of the era were learning to read: cracks at the corners of the mouth, a sore and swollen tongue, inflamed eyes. And iron, the lone mineral on the list, was the guard against the most common nutritional shortfall of all: iron deficiency anemia, which fell hardest on growing children and on women. Put back together, those 4 amounted to a deliberate patch over the most documented gaps the refined diet had opened. The white loaf would stay white, the bran and germ still gone, but the specific named consequences of their absence would be answered: 1 vitamin and 1 mineral at a time, in amounts the FDA would soon spell out to the milligram. That word, enriched, is the ghost in the machine of 1940s bread. It's printed on bread bags to this day, and most people read right past it without a thought. But in 1941, it was brand new, and it meant something specific and deliberate: that thiamine, niacin, riboflavin, and iron had been deliberately added to flour that would otherwise lack them. The FDA moved to make the term real and enforceable. In 1941, the agency established what's called a standard of identity for enriched flour, a legal definition spelling out exactly which nutrients had to be added and in what amounts before any flour could carry the word enriched on its label. You couldn't just sprinkle in a pinch and make the claim. The government had drawn a line in the flour. The people behind this weren't anonymous bureaucrats. Researchers had spent years building the science that made it possible. William Henry Sibrel, a physician and nutrition researcher known for his work on the B vitamins, including thiamine, published work on the public health aspects of enriched flour and bread and helped coordinate the rollout with bakers and millers. Russell Wilder, a physician deeply involved in wartime nutrition policy, became such a force in promoting vitamin-enriched flour and bread that years later, the American Bakers Association gave him an award specifically for his leadership in the effort. These were people who had watched deficiency diseases up close and saw, in a sack of fortified flour, a way to reach millions at once. At first, enrichment was voluntary, a cooperative effort among the Food and Nutrition Board, the American Medical Association, the FDA, and the American Bakers Association. And here's the part that surprises people. It worked even before any law forced it. The baking industry signed on willingly. Big brands began enriching their loaves. The records show that by the middle of 1942, roughly 3/4 of the white bread sold in the United States was already being baked with enriched flour, and that figure was reached through voluntary cooperation rather than mandate. The country was quietly re-nutritionalizing its daily bread, one loaf at a time, with the bakers leading. It's worth understanding why the bakers went along so willingly, because cooperation on that scale is unusual. Part of it was genuine patriotic urgency. The country was at war, and the nutrition of the population had become a national defense question. Part of it was that enrichment was cheap and simple to do. The added nutrients went into the flour in tiny quantities and changed nothing a customer would notice at the table. Not the taste, not the color, not the texture, not the price in any meaningful way. The white loaf people already loved stayed exactly the white loaf people already loved. And part of it, frankly, was good business. A baker could now stand behind a loaf that carried added nutritional value without sacrificing the soft, pale character the market demanded. The interests of public health and the interests of the bakeries, for once, pointed in the same direction. Then came the order I opened with, the one line that turned a voluntary trend into the law of the land. In January of 1943, the federal government, through the War Food Administration, issued the order commonly cited as War Food Order No. 1, mandating the enrichment of commercial white bread and flour. The first such order required that flour sold in interstate commerce be enriched to the FDA's standards, and a wartime ban on non-enriched bread pushed compliance, by the records account, to effectively the entire industry. What 3/4 of the industry had already chosen to do, the rest now had to do. For a window of wartime years, it was effectively impossible to buy a mass-produced white loaf in America that hadn't had thiamine, niacin, riboflavin, and iron deliberately added to it. That is what made 1940s bread genuinely different from the bread of the 1930s. Not a new flavor, a new formula written partly by federal order. And the deficiency diseases I mentioned at the start, the pellagra, and the beriberi that had been rising as refined flour spread. The historical accounts, including the work tied to Wonder Bread's role in the program, credit the enrichment of white flour with the addition of those B vitamins and iron as a major factor in the dramatic decline of both diseases in the United States. I want to be careful and exact here. This is the documented public health history, as the National Park Service, the FDA's own records, and nutrition science histories describe it, not a promise about any modern loaf or any modern diet. As enriched bread spread across the country in the early 1940s, those particular deficiency diseases retreated from the American population in a way the timing connects to the program. A line in a war food order written about bread lines up with the fading of diseases from hospital wards. That's the revelation the wrapper never advertised. No brand rode the enrichment story harder than Wonder Bread. Continental Baking, its maker, introduced vitamin and mineral fortification to Wonder Bread in 1941, right at the front of the program, adding thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, and iron to the loaf. And the marketing department understood instantly what it had. Out of the enrichment program came one of the most famous advertising slogans in American food history. Wonder Bread builds strong bodies, 8 ways, the 8 referring to the added nutrients. Later, as the nutrient count grew, the slogan climbed with it to builds strong bodies 12 ways. The brand sponsored the children's show Howdy Doody, where the host told a generation of kids exactly that, week after week. A vitamin program born in a wartime nutrition conference had become a jingle aimed at children, sung over a soft white loaf. That arc has a telling end, and it's part of the honest history. By 1971, the Federal Trade Commission moved against continental baking over that advertising, arguing essentially that it was unfair to tell small children, who naturally wanted to be strong, that this particular bread would make them so, when by the regulator's account its enrichment was no different from the other enriched loaves on the shelf. In other words, the very thing that made 1940s bread genuinely special, the deliberate enrichment, had by then become so universal, so standard across the whole industry, that no single brand could honestly claim it as an edge. The forgotten ingredient had won so completely that it disappeared into the background of every loaf. That's the strange fate of a successful public health idea. When it works, it stops being remarkable. It just becomes bread. But thiamine and niacin weren't the only things that made the loaves of that era what they were. And if we only talk about the vitamins, we miss the texture and the craft of the bread itself. There was another ingredient at work, one far older than any government order, that shaped how those loaves rose and browned. To understand it, you have to think about what bread actually is, mechanically. It's flour and water and salt and yeast. And the yeast is alive. Yeast eats sugar and breathes out carbon dioxide, and that gas is what lifts the dough, what fills it with the airy structure we call crumb. But white flour, on its own, doesn't hand the yeast much to eat. It's mostly long chains of starch, locked up, not the simple sugars yeast wants. So the question every baker faces, then and now, is how to feed the yeast steadily enough to get a good rise and a good brown crust. The answer, for generations of bakers, was malt. Specifically, diastatic malt, usually malted barley, sprouted and dried gently and ground into flour. Malt has been used in baking and brewing since prehistoric times, and its trick is enzymatic. Diastatic malt carries active enzymes, the diastase, which is the old name, for the amylases that nature switches on when a grain begins to sprout. When you add a little of it to bread dough, those enzymes go to work breaking the locked-up starches in the flour down into simple sugars, the easy food the yeast craves. The result is steadier fermentation, a more reliable rise, and, crucially, better browning. Those freed sugars caramelize in the oven heat, giving the crust its golden color and that faint sweetness along the edges. And they lend the baking loaf that warm, malty aroma that drifts through a bakery and a kitchen alike. A loaf made with a touch of diastatic malt rises higher and browns deeper than the same loaf made without it. For commercial bakeries chasing consistency across millions of loaves, malted barley flour was a quiet workhorse, an old ingredient doing invisible work in the dough, and it is still tucked into much of the flour on grocery shelves today, listed only as malted barley flour or simply enzymes near the bottom of the bag. And then there was the fat. The bread of that era leaned on lard and shortening, and the choice mattered more than people realize. Fat in bread dough does something specific. It shortens the gluten strands, which is literally where the word shortening comes from. By coating those gluten proteins, fat keeps them from linking into a tough, chewy network, and the loaf comes out softer and more tender with a finer crumb. Lard, rendered pork fat, was the traditional choice in countless American kitchens and bakeries, prized for the tender, almost flaky quality it gave to breads and especially to pie crusts. As the century went on, hydrogenated vegetable shortenings increasingly shared and then took that role. Wartime home recipes for the everyday loaf often called for a quarter cup of drippings or lard worked into the dough, exactly for that softening effect. So the soft, tender, pillowy character that we now associate with mid-century American white bread wasn't an accident of cheap ingredients. It was the deliberate work of fat, chosen to make the crumb yield gently under your thumb. And there's a quiet bit of chemistry behind why those loaves went stale the way they did, which is its own forgotten part of the story. Bread doesn't go hard mainly because it dries out. It goes hard because of a process called retrogradation, in which the starch molecules that swelled and softened in the oven slowly recrystallize as the loaf cools and sits, firming the crumb from the inside even in a sealed bag. The bakers of the era fought that stalling with the very ingredients we've been tracing. The fat coated the starch and slowed its march back toward crystal. The milk and the potato held moisture in the crumb. The malt and the freed sugars fed a fermentation that built a finer, more resilient structure. Even the much-maligned additives that would later creep into commercial bread, the dough conditioners and softeners, were aimed at the same old enemy, the loaf turning to stone on the counter by the second day. So the softness people remember in mid-century bread wasn't only nostalgia, and it wasn't only fat. It was a small running battle against the physics of starch itself, fought with milk, potato, fat, and malt, and won, a day or two at a time, in every kitchen and every bakery in the country. The fat was not the only thing softening those loaves, either. Bakers reached for two more humble helpers that home cooks of the era would have recognized at once: milk and potato. A little milk, often as dry milk powder folded into the dough, enriched the crumb and helped it brown, giving the loaf a tenderness and a faint sweetness that water alone could never provide. And mashed potato or potato flour was an old baker's secret for moisture and softness. The starch from the potato holds water in the crumb, keeping the bread tender and slowing the staling. So a potato loaf stays soft a day or two longer than one made of flour alone. Wartime kitchens, stretching scarce flour, leaned on these tricks out of necessity. But they were craft tricks long before they were thrift tricks. A loaf built with a little milk and a little potato, a touch of malt and a knob of lard, came out of the oven pale gold on top and cloud-soft inside. And that softness was no accident at all. Put those pieces together, and you can finally see the 1940s loaf for what it really was, a more engineered object than its plain white face let on. The flour had been stripped of its germ and brawn for shelf life, then deliberately reloaded with thiamine, niacin, riboflavin, and iron by enrichment, a formula that became federal law in 1943. A touch of diastatic malt fed the yeast and gilded the crust. Lard, or shortening, tenderized the crumb, and milk and potato kept it soft. Every quality of that bread, its whiteness, its softness, its long life on the shelf, its golden top, and its quietly restored nutrition, was the product of a deliberate decision somewhere upstream. The loaf only looked simple. It was, in truth, one of the most carefully designed everyday foods the country had ever produced. There's a smaller wartime episode that captures just how seriously, and sometimes how absurdly, the government took bread in those years. On January 18, 1943, the same month as the enrichment order, the United States banned the sale of pre-sliced bread. Food Distribution Order. Number 1 prohibited bakeries from selling bread already sliced. The reasoning, as the Smithsonian and other accounts describe it, was about conserving resources, keeping rising flour costs from hitting consumers, and, by some accounts, shoring up supplies of the heavy wax paper that sliced bread needed in greater amounts to stay fresh. For a few strange weeks, Americans had to slice their own loaves at home again, fumbling with bread knives and crooked slices, risking, as the rationing authorities themselves put it, thumbs and tempers. The backlash was swift, and the ban was rescinded on March the 8th, less than 2 months in. It's a small story, but it tells you something true. In 1943, bread was treated as a matter of national policy, sliced and unsliced alike, right down to the wax paper. It's worth glancing across the ocean, too, because Britain ran a parallel and even more dramatic experiment with wartime bread. The two countries went in opposite directions with the same kernel of wheat. Where America kept its flour white and added the nutrients back, Britain simply kept more of the grain. At the war's outbreak, millers were directed toward higher extraction flour, and by 1942, the government moved to a so-called national flour milled to an 85% extraction rate, meaning far more of the wheat kernel, bran and germ alike, stayed in the flour than in American white flour, which kept only around 70%. The higher extraction stretched scarce imported wheat, yielding more flour from every shipload that ran the U-boat gauntlet. Bakers were largely restricted to producing the national loaf, a darker, denser, fortified wholemeal bread with added calcium and vitamins. And as the war ground on, milk powder, potato, and potato flour were among the permitted additions to stretch it further. It was not beloved. People grumbled about its grayish color and heavy, dense texture. But it kept a nation fed through scarcity. Notably, bread itself was never formally rationed in Britain during the war, because officials feared that restricting something, as fundamental as the daily loaf, would crush civilian morale. Two countries, two different bread strategies, both reaching the same conclusion in the same years: that the loaf was too important to leave alone. After the war, the American story took another turn, one that explains why the bread on shelves today says enriched but doesn't always require it. The mandatory war food order was repealed in 1946. The wartime emergency had passed, and with it, the legal requirement. But the idea had taken hold and proven itself, and the practice didn't vanish. In 1952, official standards of identity for enriched bread were put in place. Under that framework, enrichment was no longer mandatory at the federal level, but the rule was clear. If a product was going to be labeled enriched, it had to meet the defined standard, hitting the specified levels of those added nutrients. The word kept its meaning even when the mandate relaxed. Many states, and eventually much of the industry, kept enriching anyway, because by then it was simply how American bread was made. The post-war years only deepened the white loaf's reign. As the suburbs spread and the supermarket replaced the corner bakery, soft, sliced, enriched white bread became the very emblem of modern American plenty, stacked in bright bags under brand names that promised freshness and strength. For a couple of decades, it was simply what bread was. Then the wheel turned again. By the 1970s and beyond, a generation raised. On the pillowy white loaf began drifting back toward the darker, coarser, whole-grain breads their great-grandparents had eaten out of necessity. The very breads the roller mill had once shoved aside as peasant food. The wheel had come full circle. The brown loaf, once the cheap bread of the poor, then the discarded byproduct of industrial milling, returned as the premium choice, often costing more than the white bread that had displaced it. And through all of it, the enrichment endured, quietly riding along in the white bread that never went away, still carrying its 4 wartime nutrients, and later, its folic acid, into kitchens that had long since forgotten why those names were on the bag at all. And the story didn't end with the 4 wartime nutrients, which is part of why enrichment endured. Decades later, the same basic idea, fortify the universal food to reach the whole population, returned for a different deficiency. In the 1990s, the FDA moved to require folic acid in enriched grain products after research connected the B vitamin to a reduction in certain serious birth defects of the brain and spine. Once again, the reasoning echoed. 1941. You reach everyone through the food everyone already eats. So the folic acid you now see on a bread label is a direct descendant of the wartime enrichment program. The same strategy applied to a new problem 2 generations later. The machinery the 1940s built, the standards of identity, the idea of the loaf as a delivery vehicle for public health, was still running. It helps to remember what bread meant to the people making these decisions, because that's why they chose it. Bread wasn't just one food among many. For centuries, it had been called the staff of life, the food so fundamental that to break bread with someone was to share life itself. It crossed every line in American society, rich and poor, every region, every background. A wealthy family and a struggling one might agree on almost nothing at the dinner table, except that there would be bread on it. That universality was precisely the point. When the planners at the Mayflower Hotel looked for a way to reach an entire nation's health at once, they didn't pick some specialty food the well-off would buy. They picked the one thing that was already on every table. In the country, the humblest, most democratic food there was, and they quietly loaded it with what the nation needed. There's something almost moving in that choice. A decision to heal a country through its most ordinary daily bread, rather than through some product only a few could afford. So when you stand in a grocery aisle today and pick up a soft white loaf, run your eyes to the ingredient list, and you'll likely see them still. Thiamine mononitrate, niacin, riboflavin, reduced iron, and the folic acid added in later decades, and very often a little lower, malted barley flour doing its old quiet work. Those words are the living fingerprint of what happened in those war years. They are the forgotten ingredients, hiding in plain sight, the deliberate answer to a problem the roller mill created and a war forced the country to finally confront. Most shoppers walk right past them. They're just part of the label, background noise on the bag. But each one is a small monument to a decision made in a hotel ballroom in 1941 and signed into a war food order in 1943. Think back to where we started, to that single line in a federal order in the middle of a war, and to the question of what really made 1940s bread special. It wasn't a flavor you could name. You couldn't taste the thiamine. The malt was a whisper, the lard a softness, the milk and potato an invisible tenderness, the enrichment completely silent on the tongue. What made that bread special was the intention packed into it, the quiet, deliberate national project of putting back into the daily loaf what the modern mill had taken out and doing it through the one food that reached absolutely everyone. The bread looked like the plainest thing in the world. It was actually one of the most considered. A country at war looked at the soft white loaf on every table and decided it could carry not just calories, but a measure of the nation's health, written in 3 vitamins and a mineral that no one would ever see. The records are still there to read, in the National Park Service histories, in the FDA's own account of food standards, in the files of the National Academy of Sciences, in the proceedings of that 1941 conference itself. They describe an experiment in feeding a whole people through their most ordinary habit, and a deficiency disease chapter of American medicine that quietly closed as the enriched loaves rolled out by the millions. It's history, careful and documented, not a claim about your next sandwich. But it's a reminder that even the most forgettable food on the shelf can carry a story this large, folded inside its crumb. So here's what I'll leave you with. The next time you pull a slice, from the bag, soft and pale and utterly unremarkable, turn the wrapper over and find those long, chemical-sounding names near the bottom of the list. That's the forgotten ingredient. That's the war food order, and the hotel ballroom and the doctors who counted deficiency cases, all still riding along in a 9-cent idea that grew up with the century. If you've got a grandmother or grandfather who lived through the 1940s, ask them whether they remember the word enriched first appearing on the bread, or the strange weeks when sliced bread vanished from the stores, because their memory is part of this record too. And tell me in the comments, did you know your everyday bread was quietly rewritten by a wartime order? Or is this the first time anyone's pointed to the small print and told you what it really means? If this changed the way you'll look at the next loaf you buy, pass it along to someone who's never once thought about what's hiding in their bread.